Recording has started.
Excellent. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen share going. And we're going to get this La Florida party started. So here's my beautiful start screen. So go ahead and welcome very much to my class. I'm super excited to be able to offer this in this super cool New World Symposium that we are offering here through the Barony of Marinus. I am new-ish to the barony, and I'll also be leaving the barony shortly. But for those that don't know me, thank you, Beatrice, for my introduction. Yes, I am Magistrissa Anna Dokeianina Syrakousina. I currently live here in Marinus. I moved to St. Petersburg, Florida when I was 5 years old from Long Island. So I don't consider myself a New Yorker. I do consider myself a Floridian. So those of us from the Tampa Bay area refer to ourselves as Tempeño or Tempeña. My great-grandfather may have actually emigrated to the U.S. from Italy through Tampa in the 1920s when there was a ban on Italians. And if that's so, that actually makes me a third-generation Tempeña. So a little bit of land acknowledgement here. I was born on Massapequa's land. I grew up on Tocobaga and Seminole land. I currently live on Chesapeake and Lumbee land here in Norfolk, Virginia. I have also lived on Wampanoag, Narragansett, Abenaki, and Kumeyaay lands. And regardless of what my mother says about a Cherokee relative, we don't have one. I spat in a tube and I am 100% European and Middle Eastern. So a couple things just to go over before we get started. I firmly believe that everyone will be well behaved, but just in case. So this class was actually designed to give a taste of the vibrant and civilized cultures that once thrived on the Florida Peninsula. It's not comprehensive because there's so much information to cover, and I could probably teach like a semester on the Timucua alone. So growing up in Florida, it's actually required to take Florida history, including ancient history. So this includes a great deal of pre-contact history in elementary school and middle school. We were always taught to kind of view the conquistadors as the bad guys. They're not good. And this is just going to reinforce those views. So there's nothing woke about this. They were absolutely horrific people. Now, I also understand that those of us who were raised in the Spanish colonies get a way different perspective on American history than those who were raised in the British colonies. But we need to remember that the actions of all European colonizers were not good or better than the others, even if I might come off as a little pro-Spain at times. We can never obviously accept, history is what it is, but I ask that, please don't play devil's advocate or, get white nationalist in this class. Beatrice will probably go ahead and yeet you. But we're going to go ahead and get started. So if you haven't visited native-land.ca before, I highly recommend that you do. It actually provides an approximate map of the cultures or the lands that you live on today. So this is a map of the greater Florida area. It gives you an idea of some of the cultures that we're going to be talking about. This is not all of them at all. And I'll actually be discussing some other ones that aren't shown here only because we're not zoomed in. I did actually add Tocobaga, but we're missing the Tequesta and the Calusa down here, which are actually super important in the whole grand scheme of Florida ancient history. And so what was actually considered La Florida? So it was, obviously we know the Florida Peninsula and the Panhandle, but it also includes what's now today the Alabama Panhandle and the Mississippi Panhandle, pretty much up into the Mississippi River Delta in Louisiana. And at times it actually overlapped into New Orleans. There was a period of time where Spain actually did have control over Louisiana. This is a super cool map, actually, if you want to take a look at it. So this is a true in-SCA period map of the Florida Peninsula, and it's from the Cantino Planisphere. It's dated to 1502. So I went ahead and I added the St. Johns River inlet there. I think that's the St. Johns and not the St. Mary's. And then Tampa Bay would be the little triple bay right there. And I think these little islands would have been the Keys. It's very interesting the way that they have drawn it, but kind of give you an idea of how the old world was viewing this land as they were coming in. here's a basic timeline of Spanish Florida. I understand that not everybody gets taught this, so I wanted to go ahead and just kind of give a brief overview. I do very much like humor in my classes, so if you haven't taken one with me before, sorry, not sorry. So the peninsula or Florida was quote unquote claimed by Ponce de Leon in 1513. Panfilo de Narvaez, who I like to refer to from here on out as Conquistador Chad, he landed near Tampa Bay in what is now St. Petersburg in 1528 to begin the expedition that would take his men all the way to Mexico City. Hernando de Soto, conquistador of Veruca Salt, lands in Tampa Bay in 1539 and starts genociding his way up the coast. De Soto was not a good person. He's probably the worst one that actually came across Florida. He was hanging out with Pizarro down in Peru and conquered the Inca Empire. So he was looking for gold and riches that he was accustomed to in South America that he was not going to find in this particular region of North America. He took this very personally and just decided to temper tantrum his way up into the Appalachians and back. So, yes, we did have the French attempted to colonize Florida. This went poorly with Fort Caroline, in which, as you can see, a little profane here. The French did, in fact, fuck around and find out with Fort Caroline in 1564. They attempted to set up a small Huguenot colony, and the Spanish went in there and, with the help of the local natives, and destroyed the settlement. St. Augustine was founded a year later in 1565, so suck it, Jamestown. The peninsula was actually transferred to Britain in 1763, and then Spain decided they wanted it back in 1783. And then going, of course, into more national history with Pinckney's Treaty, which was in 1795, which established different boundaries as far as what was the United States and what was still unceded territory. And then the occupation of Pensacola in 1814 by Andrew Jackson in the waning years of the War of 1812. So, and that eventually ceded Florida to the United States. Whoops, too far. Too far. Too far. So I'm getting a little excited here. So yeah, Florida history is actually super cool and interesting, and isn't all of us smoking the meths and riding alligators. But we aren't here to talk about us crazy white folk. We are here to talk about natives. So these are some of the nations that existed on the Florida Peninsula prior to the foundation of St. Augustine or San Augustine, depending on what you prefer. Now, the ones that I will be discussing today are in bold, that we actually don't know a lot about all of them. So in the case of like the ice and the Miami, you'll notice that I actually don't have as much as I do on, say, like, you know, the Calusa or the Timucua, which were the two largest nations in the region. So like, for example, we have the Guacata, there's like nothing on them. There's the Yega, the Guarangumbe, and the Maracumbe were actually, I believe, on the Keys and may have been sub-tribes of the Tequesta. We have the Miccosukee, which are still present today in the Everglades area. I believe they were absorbed by the Seminoles. We'll talk about the Seminoles in a second. The Taino are your Caribbean Arawak nation, and they were ocean going. We do have evidence of some Taino settlements in South Florida, but they're not really what I would consider to be a Florida nation. And then we have several major archaeological cultures that have been identified that we'll talk a little bit about today. You have your Timucuan culture, your Safety Harbor culture, Belle Glade, Caloosahatchee, and the Mississippian. So for those who know a little bit more about archaeology, especially North American archaeology, you'll probably recognize these cultures. But so yeah, where are the Seminoles? So the Seminoles are not an ancient nation. They did not exist at this time. They are what's considered an ethnogenesis, which means that they were born from other cultures as a result of colonial destruction from the previous Florida nations, Creek that were fleeing British occupation and then escaped African slaves. So the Creek migrated down into the Florida Peninsula. They ended up intermarrying with the natives that were still here, I'm in Virginia right now, there. And in addition to escaped slaves as well. And so that actually gave birth to a whole new culture, and that is the Seminole Nation, which is still today the unconquered native nation in the United States. And so it's one thing that us Floridians are very proud to boast is our incredible and wonderful native cultures. So let's go ahead and start talking about them. So we have the ice. We'll start in alphabetical order. So if you've ever heard of Indian River, that's where they lived. So they lived basically between Cape Canaveral and the Indian River. It used to be called the River Ice. The capital, quote unquote, is Port St. Lucie, or Santa Lucia as it was at the time, or Santa Lucia. Best primary source we have on them is Jonathan Dickinson's journal, which is actually post-period, but there's a lot of, he gives some incredible accounts of just interactions with them. And then, of course, Father Menendez, who founded St. Augustine, he also talks about when he went down to found a fort at St. Lucia in 1566, and he wasn't so nice in his descriptions of them, unfortunately. And they didn't want them around, and that's cool. And he basically was threatening them to bring in, like, basically an army of Spaniards that would have controlled them. And we don't know a whole lot about when they disappeared, but my guess is that they didn't last much longer from this point, since they had such a small swath of land. But one of the more major nations in Florida were the Calusa, and they were the political power in Southwest Florida. You can consider them a kingdom, if not even like an empire. I mean, obviously not to the grandeur of something like Aztec or Maya, but they obviously had contact with Mesoamerica, and they were a shell-based culture for the most part, and so they didn't have any agriculture. I actually don't think that maize grows well south of the Tampa Bay area, so you tend to not see it in these areas. But needless, let me just get back on the slide here. Very ancient culture. So they descended from Florida's first inhabitants, who probably migrated across land or across the Gulf of Mexico by canoe from Central America. They were entirely concentrated in Southwest Florida, with most of their capitals in Punta Gorda, Fort Myers, and Naples today. And but the political power, you can see on this map, the light blue is the political extent of the Calusa. And so it basically extended to southeastern Florida, and they governed the Miami, Tequesta, Diega, and probably the Ais and Mayaca cultures as well. They were also a force to be reckoned with. Calusa does mean the fierce ones, and there's a little bit of a myth, I didn't include it here, that it was believed that the Calusa chased Narvaez up the coast, and it was actually a poisoned Calusa arrow that took him down, while his expedition did continue, but he didn't make it out of the peninsula. And so we actually have a radio station in South Florida called The Arrow, and that's kind of in honor of the Calusa taking down Narvaez. But so you have the Caloosahatchee culture is one of the more ancient cultures in South Florida, and as you can see, we're talking 500, if not even earlier, to 1750. So 1750 is roundabout when we last saw any evidence of the Calusa. And then they also had an incredibly complex government, culture, and system of towns. They had two-story buildings that were reported to hold up to 2,000 occupants. So they had large halls. They were skilled builders, but they did not do widespread farming. Instead, what they focused on was actually stocked fisheries and estuaries. So they were building in inlets and rivers. They were actually building estuaries with nets and breeding and stocking their own fish. The name of the kingdom of the Calusa is recorded as being called as Campaba. So I'm just checking the chat real quick here. She's just posting. Alrighty. Beatrice got you all. I ain't too worried about it. So yes, so those are, and I love this artwork. I'm going to be sharing a lot of illustrations done by some local artists in Florida as well. But this gives you a sense of scale of what the Calusa were actually capable of. I think that a lot of people, when they think of nations, especially along the East Coast or Gulf Coast, because of the heat, you assume these small villages, and we did have the small villages too. Some other of the nations actually liked more of like the smaller, isolated living. The Calusa were not like this. They were widespread. They built cities. They built towns. They and like I said, they actually worked in aquaculture and maintained fisheries, which is incredible. Um, which I think is wicked cool anyway. But so, next slide. Did I freeze? Oh no, what's going on? Whoop, yeah. All right, yes, okay. So onto the Muskegee or the Creek, and you'll notice I refer to them as enemies to the north. So the Muskegee are still, obviously still around today. That's a beautiful modern photograph of some Muskegee natives. They are actually part of the ancient Mississippian culture. So they were known for their urban civilization and mound building skills around the entire bend of the Gulf Coast. They cultivated maize. It was brought up from Mesoamerica. So again, here's another nation that clearly either migrated from or still had intricate trade routes to the Central American cultures. They were a warlike, conquering nation that held a great deal of territory in what is now Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and North Florida. And the best part is that they smoked DeSoto's exhibition like a boss when he tried to go up into up into the Smoky Mountains. He didn't do too well, and I believe he died on the way back. In fact, they did so much damage to his expedition that the remaining Spaniards fled. They went back to their boats, or at least went back to the shoreline, got on ships, and left. So, and this is actually an illustration of a Muskegee native, I believe in the 18th century. We just don't have as many woodcuts of them from period, so I do apologize. They were considered one of the 5 civilized tribes by the US government, which I think is seriously gross if you're familiar with that concept. But it was basically the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, um, the Seminole, and I'm missing one, and I apologize profusely. For missing that last nation. But yeah, those were the tribes that were basically unconquered, so to speak, the ones that fought the hardest back and were the easiest, the most difficult to move. But they were considered civilized. And mostly, I think it's because they were willing to work with the English at one point in time. And I'll talk about that a little bit coming up, actually. So the Creek actually did work with mercenaries for English colonists in Georgia and the Carolinas, and they were used to attack other Florida tribes. So it's a little bit post period, but if you ever get a chance to go to Savannah and then you get a chance to go to St. Augustine and you read plaques around either cities, you're going to get points of view from 2 different avenues. So you will read very pro-British propaganda in Savannah, and then you'll read very pro-Spanish propaganda in St. Augustine. And it's worth it alone to kind of give you a little snicker. I mean, neither are probably good and are probably written from a wholly colonial perspective. But long story short is that the English frequently would hire and dress the Muskegee to go down into Florida and basically start attacking the Timucua, and eventually did weaken their defenses enough. And that is sort of when everything went down and Spain had to cede the peninsula to Great Britain. Also, as populations in Florida became affected by disease and colonization, the Muskegee invaded southward. They eventually destroyed the weakened Caloosahatchee nations by 1800. So that includes the Calusa that I just mentioned. And then, of course, despite holding their own and doing an extremely good job, they were forcibly removed in 1820 and forced to Oklahoma, where their largest nation is still today. They do have satellite nations in Georgia and Alabama as well. But yes, they do still exist today, and they have wonderful information online for those that might be interested in them. But they are our antagonists. So we have the Miami, known for their inland waterworks. So they settled around Lake Okeechobee. The name itself means big water after the lake, and it was later applied to a river that gives a certain city its namesake. Wonder what city that is. They were another mound building civilization. We don't know a whole lot about them, but we know that they also built canals and other earthen works to navigate the inland Everglades. So that's the rendering that I'm showing is potential Miami natives working their way around Lake Okeechobee and the surrounding Everglades by building canals for their dugout canoes. They were considered part of the Belle Glade culture in an archaeological context. But we're going to go on to our North Florida empire, so to speak, and that is the Timucua. So we know a lot about the Timucua. The Spanish documented them extremely well and lived among them for 200 years. So a lot of the woodcuts that I will be showing shortly are actually from SCA period, so the 16th century. The Spanish actually described them as giants, which is sort of funny because most archaeological record of the Timucua show them as being just maybe a smidge close to 6 feet, but they weren't all that tall. The Spanish were just so malnourished that they just perceived the natives as just being massive. So unlike the empire-like political nature of the Calusa, the Timucua was actually more of a loose confederation of smaller chiefdoms that shared a common language. So you had this whole region that I'm showing there of chiefdoms, or caciques, I should say, that spoke Timucua or dialects of Timucua, but they were not necessarily all politically tied to, say, St. Augustine or the Jacksonville area where they were most heavily concentrated. We do know that the settlement that is at what is now St. Augustine dates back to at least 1100, 1300, and that includes finds, I believe, potsherds from Muskogee sites in Georgia. So that indicates an awesome trade network up into I think like the Athens area. So it's actually pretty far north into Muskogee territory. And of course, as I mentioned, the Muskegees also traded um, across the Gulf and down into Mexico. So we had this incredible network of trade going on. And because of that, and of course, the climate in North Florida varying from that of South Florida, they were able to grow maize. They also hunted and ate fish and shellfish, so both an agricultural and an aquacultural society. They were described as being extremely athletic. Women were described as being able of easily climbing trees and structures to pick fruit or hunt or do what they needed to do, including drawing moss or other fibers down to create textiles. They also had a documented transgender population. And by transgender, I kind of use that term loosely. The archaic term for it is a bardash, but more modernly, we like to use the term two-spirit. So men who basically made the choice to live as women, mostly because they didn't want to be fighters. Only when you hear the word two-spirit today, a lot of it has connotations with the Southwestern or Plains natives, which held them in a bit more of a higher spiritual or social regard than the Timucua did. The Timucua did not treat them in the same basically the same manner. They were given the dirty jobs. So if you look at this illustration I have here, again, this is an actual woodcut from the 16th century that has just been colorized for your enjoyment. You have your two spirits, men who are dressed as women with their hair down and fluffed, wearing skirts made from Spanish moss, carrying the wounded or gravely ill from battlefields. So their job was to dig graves, to take care of the sick and injured, to carry provisions and munitions and all that to battle sites. They also would go with women who were gathering food and would carry the baskets for the women. So it is an identified third gender, but it was not necessarily seen as something wholly spiritual. It was an option. It was a choice that you made, that you were given if you chose not to fight, and you would just have to live as women. So that is something that to keep in mind as well. But I just thought it was incredibly cool and worth sharing. So here's another great woodcut of the Timucua. But the Timucua might have been too nice to the Europeans. So um, we have an image here who is the son of the cacique, Saturiwa, who was the chief, or cacique, who overseeing the Jacksonville area. And he's showing French explorer René Laudonnière the monument that was left by Jean Ribault at Fort Caroline, which is now part of Jacksonville. As I've previously mentioned, Fort Caroline is gone. Poof, we have no record of it. We have a general idea of where it was, but more than likely we think that it has been completely eaten up by the St. Johns River at this point, just by rising waters over time, not necessarily um, quick climate change, because we haven't really been able to find it, I mean, much of anything in years. But there is record of Jean Ribault leaving a monument with the French coat of arms. He basically tried to claim the peninsula for France and the Huguenots after Ponce de Leon already claimed it for Spain. So we know how this went. If you know how history went, the Spanish were not having it. They went in and they completely destroyed the settlement. They ended up taking the women and children back with them to St. Augustine, and you can actually see their graves, because they ended up bringing the women and children back and killed them. And so there is a Huguenot cemetery that is in Jacksonville, just outside of the old city walls, where these people, these unfortunate French Protestants, were buried. De Soto absolutely devastated the western Timucua. So if you go back to the map of the Timucua here, you'll notice that they do go up north of Tampa Bay, into the Big Bend, heading up into the Georgia line. That was basically the march that he took. So on his way, he basically walked through what is now, let's say, Brooksville, Ocala, Gainesville, that area, and all of the Timucua settlements that were in his way. If they didn't give him gold, he basically just slaughtered them all, because that's what they did with the Inca. Although the Inca were, I mean, again, the conquistadors were not great, but he was so spoiled. That's why I refer to De Soto as conquistador of Veruca Salt. I want it now, and he didn't get it. He was already fat, dumb, rich, and happy from conquering the Inca, but that wasn't good enough. He wasn't finding what he wanted to find in Florida. You know, most of the natural resources in Florida are going to be shells and whatever they were growing. I don't want to say the cultures were primitive, but they were not wealthy. And he was not having it. And so he basically just sort of scourged his way up. And then eventually the creek took care of him. Let's see what else here. We have a ton of artwork of the Timucua, because, again, the Europeans were in most contact with them. And it's funny today when you see images of quote unquote Florida Indians, they're almost always Timucua and not Seminole. So if you even look at the seal of Florida today, where you see the native woman, that's a Timucua woman. And I absolutely love this. It's another colorized woodcut that it actually does show a bit more detail. So if you're familiar with Vecellio's costume book, or Clothing of the Renaissance World as it has been released as, so these illustrations might look a little similar if you've seen the King and Queen of Florida, respectively. So the engravings are done by a man called Theodore de Bry, and you should be able to locate them online if you're super interested in that level of art history. But here is your Florida royalty. So you have your king, you have your Saturiwa here, and then his queen. And I love that he's actually wearing visibly European textiles. So they were trading openly. I mean, I know that the Creek, Muskegee were weaving, but I don't think to that particular level. But he looks like he's basically wearing a Spanish bed curtain, to be completely honest with you. But to create his royal robes, and he's incredibly stylish. But you see their wonderful top knots that they were known for, that made them appear way taller to the Spanish, and how the king and the queen, respectively, have tattoos all over their bodies. They were a tattooed culture using the stick and poke method. So basically, the tattoos were done doing tiny little dots at a time until the pattern was created. And I love that the colorization actually makes that pop just that little bit more. All right, the Tequesta. I need to take a drink for just a second here. So, yes, they were living in South Beach before it was cool. So the Tequesta existed in southeastern Florida from about 300 BCE to 1700. They were another non-agricultural community, predominantly hunter and fisher. Their diet was reported to have included seal and manatee, which, I mean, it sounds scary now, but it was a food source and a common food source. They're just unfortunately endangered now because we have decided that we want boats with props and we want coats and we want all sorts of fancy things, and we're not just using them for food. But one of the neat things about the Tequesta is that they would migrate from closer to the Everglades to actually down into the Keys for mosquito season. So in the summertime, they would actually leave the swampier areas and go out onto the Keys where there was a better breeze and less standing water. And they understood that. And I'm not sure about naturally occurring malaria or other diseases in Florida. I'm sure there were. The European diseases were obviously far more devastating in the long run, but I always found that very neat that DeCasta knew to like leave at a certain when the bugs got too bad, they're like, we're out and we're going to the Keys. Bye. They might have actually spoken Calusa and have been a part of the Caloosahatchee culture. As I previously shown, the Calusa pretty much dominated South Florida. And so they probably fell under the political sphere of the Calusa rulers from over here in the Fort Myers area. But the Tequesta obviously led a much more simpler life than those across the peninsula from them. Some beautiful artwork from another local Florida artist, and they were rumored to have practiced human sacrifice. We only have one source that says it, that the Cacique was going to sacrifice a young woman and that the missionaries made him stop. So my guess is that they didn't, and that the Spanish were just finding a way to other the tribe as savages. They were bakers. They were able to make a bread from the root of the kunti plant. The kunti is actually it looks like a very tiny Christmas tree, by the way. It's kind of cool. And they would pull out the roots and powder it down to make a flour and then create a bread from that. And they also used tobacco, which meant that they had a trade network that was coming up here into what is now the Carolinas and Virginia, where tobacco grows, and were able to trade it down as far as, I mean, this is Miami, so that tells you it traveled quite a bit so that they can consume it. And then, of course, the nation that is near and dear to my heart, the Chocobaga. So the land of the fire sticks. The Chocobaga are part of the safety harbor culture. So we're looking at about 900 to 1700. They were a mound building culture, but not very agricultural. So when you see the Chocobaga settlements and illustrations of them, they're very much reminiscent of a Norman motte and bailey. So they would build their mound, put a larger hall on top of the mound, and then the village would be built around the base of the mound, which I thought was pretty cool. And as my husband and I have discussed, there's nothing new in architecture. Obviously, your best mode of defense is to make people run uphill. So you build your mound, and then they basically had to try to run up toward the keep to get you. And I wrote here, unfortunately, dealt with both Chad and Farouk assault on their landing. Yes, both Hernando de Soto and Panfilo de Narvaez landed on the Pinellas Peninsula, where I grew up. There's actually signage that tells you where Narvaez landed, and it's constantly getting vandalized. But yeah, so it gives you an idea that they unfortunately got devastated relatively quickly because of the conquistador expeditions and then subsequent raids and invasions from the Muskegee. They disappeared almost completely by 1700, with anybody left probably just moved downward a little bit and joined with the Calusa. So here's a nice illustration of a Tocobaga village, which again, you have this mound with the keep, the main keep on top, and then the surrounding huts. They also may have fallen politically under the Calusa kingdom. Tampa is actually from the Calusa word tanpa, which means fire sticks. And obviously fire sticks, if anyone's ever been to the Tampa Bay area, we named our hockey team the reason for a good reason. It is the lightning capital of North America. So fire sticks, or tampa in this case, literally means fire from the sky. It's lightning. Tampa was also a Calusa settlement, and the Tocobaga focused more on the Pinellas Peninsula, whereas Clearwater and St. Petersburg are today. And their major settlement was at Safety Harbor, which is an absolutely gorgeous site if you ever get a chance to visit. They were heavy shellfish eaters, with many middens being found in the Tampa Bay area. Like, there are shell middens and mounds all over the place. Like, you go to the beach and there's something, it's a Tocobaga shell midden. And for those who don't know what a midden is, I'm sorry, but a midden is basically a garbage pile. It's a discard pile for waste. So most middens that we find are kitchen middens. And so it gives you an idea of what was being eaten by a certain point in time. For example, when I was doing an excavation in New Hampshire, we had a kitchen midden out the back window of the house that we were working on, and we had actually pulled like half a cow out of the kitchen midden, as well as like a ton of plates, because they would just throw out their plates when you'd get a new set of plates. I always thought that was really cool, but same idea, but it gives you a better sense of their diet, and also tool making, since most of their tools were made from shell. So we have a silly legend regarding the Tocobaga and their mounds that are placed strategically around the Pinellas Peninsula. So basically, it serves as protection against hurricanes. And a lot of people, when I tell this to people, I get looked at like I'm crazy. Like, you don't actually believe that, do you? And I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, I have seen hurricanes and tropical storms veer away from Tampa Bay at the last minute. And this actually includes Irma. Like, Irma was supposed to literally go up Tampa Bay, which would have been incredibly devastating for people on both sides of Tampa Bay. It would have actually destroyed my parents' house in Clearwater. Even though they live on high ground, they still got hurricane force winds. It was still a bad day. But if it had tracked a couple more miles like westward to Tampa Bay, it would have been horrifically bad. You had Hurricane Charlie in 2004, which was actually its final track within like 48 hours. I think 24 hours actually had the hurricane going straight into Tampa Bay. And then it ended up veering east really quick. All of a sudden, it just turned in around Port Charlotte, south of Sarasota, in that area. And it was horrific. It was a category 4. It was nothing, to take a deep breath off of. But again, it was just random. And when I was a child, I remember Tropical Storm Marco. We had to go to school during tropical storms, by the way. This was a normal occurrence. So I went to school during Tropical Storm Marco. I was in 3rd grade, and it actually just barely grazed the coast. It like bounced off, ricocheted off of the Pinellas Peninsula coast instead of crossing the peninsula like we thought it was going to. And if you really don't believe me, look at all the wonky tracks of the 2004 storms. They all completely avoid the Tampa Bay area. And I'm sure there's a perfectly good scientific reason that has to do with currents and the temperature of the water and all sorts of real science involved. But for all of us locals, we just very much love the idea of having that like local magic left to us from the Tocobaga. And it's something that, even though we're all white and we're colonizers, that we're very proud of. And we will die on that hill. But just to talk about some general clothing trends as well. I'm looking at for time here. We're still doing extremely well on time. But so clothing, most of them almost all wore the same thing in some way. So, as I mentioned briefly, the Muskegee did weave and did beading, but I think a lot of that has to do with contact from their Midwestern nations and, of course, closer contact to the Mesoamerican nations. Most Florida nations wove simple textiles from Spanish moss and then various species of palm. They also created clothing from deerskin for when it does actually get cold. And that is, of course, if they wore clothing at all, because this is Florida, and there's days where I just want to take my skin completely off. So I can't even imagine, not having AC and the creature comforts of modern living. But for them, it was their way of life. And then, of course, you had the body painting, which would have kept you cool, but it also helped ward off biting insects. It probably also protected your skin from the sun to a certain point as well. And as I mentioned, the Timucua were heavily tattooed using the stick and poke method. You don't see tattoos. There's a lot more reports of painting with the Calusa, and the Timucua seemed more tattooed. And I think that the Virginia natives also tattooed. So there might be a connection there, but don't hold me to it. I'm not a Native American archaeologist. I just like looking at cool pictures. And then, of course, we have the hair was kept long and combed. It was clean and maintained. Men from almost all nations, I'm sure you saw the pictures, would cut their short bangs and then bring the lengths up into a bun at the top of their head. And that added to their height and made them more intimidating to the Spanish. Women appeared to have left their hair down completely. So, general foodways, and that's another wonderful engraving from the same previous artist that shows Timucua women sowing corn, actually. So they did know agriculture in the northern part of the peninsula, where there's actually soil and clay. The clay line kind of runs, I want to say, about 100 miles north of Tampa Bay. Then all of a sudden things change from being a sandbar to there actually being real clay and soil. You really can't grow good stuff in sand. I have tried. Most of us who try to grow our own vegetables in Florida fail miserably, or we have to do raised beds, and raised beds are never foolproof. Nasty cutworms will find their way into your raised beds or pots or whatever you try to do. So it was it's incredibly difficult to to grow food there. So obviously the hunter-gatherer culture thrived much better than those who tried to have cultivated agriculture. But most importantly, if you could catch it or hunt it, you could eat it. So, and anything was on the menu. So manatee rays, sharks, dolphins, alligators, crocodiles, snakes, tons of shellfish, any kinds of naturally occurring berry or root. There's squash, of course. There's native squashes. Papayas are native. Citrus is not native to Florida. That was completely brought over by the Spanish. Um, and here's another tidbit that I did not include that's just going to make if you feel bad, but um, only 20% of the state of Florida is actually native vegetation at this point. So that's why the state is so incredibly strict about what can and cannot be planted. Everything is invasive. Um, Everything that has been brought, like I said, the citrus and palms were almost entirely brought by the Spanish. There are naturally occurring palms, palmettos. I always say they're much smaller, or like a sable palm, I believe, is also it's also a native palm. But the big, tall, beautiful ones that scream Florida, yeah, no, those are imported from Europe, as well as coconuts and other fruits that sort of scream Florida, so to speak. And obviously, since you have such a shell-based culture and shellfish-based culture, most tools and points were made of shell versus rock, because it was naturally occurring and they were basically everywhere. So,
This is your 10-minute warning.
thank you, love. So, Cherokee Choctaw, Chickasaw. Thank you so much, Beatrice. I'm checking the chat when I can get there. But yeah, we're getting close here. So next, please. I'm freezing again. I need a new computer, so I apologize if this. There we go. Advance. Come on. All right. So yeah, the real first Thanksgiving actually occurred on September 8th, 1565. So much like suck at Jamestown, you can also suck at Plymouth. So on the arrival to the site that would be St. Augustine, Pedro Menendez de Avila and his 800 accompanying Spanish soldiers and colonists invited the local tribe, the Seloy of the Timucua, to sit a feast of Thanksgiving, and this is reported to what was on the menu. So you have cocido, which was a Spanish stew made from salt pork, garbanzo beans with lots of garlic, served with hardtack and red wine. Now that doesn't sound awful. It sounds almost kind of like a ham bone soup with beans. Probably a little too salty for my liking, but I mean, you put in a ton of garlic and you're golden, right? But obviously you can stick the hardtack in there and soften it up. And I'm sure the wine tasted phenomenal after traveling across the breadth of the Atlantic Ocean in the heat of the summer. And then the Timucua basically brought the house down. They basically brought venison, turkey, gopher tortoise, a variety of fish and shellfish, local beans, squash, and maize. So it must have been quite a party. And the next time you have Thanksgiving, so rethink your cranberry sauce and maybe substitute in some gopher tortoise. Or not, I'm kidding. Please don't. They're actually very endangered. But I do want to have a real first Thanksgiving eventually. So I just have to track down some venison in addition to the turkey and then all the fish and shellfish. Obviously, squash and maize has become sort of synonymous with North American cuisine anyway. But so the next time you're in Florida, please do me a favor and skip Disney. We would love to have you visit one of our many beautiful archaeological preserves. So I only listed a few. There are dozens. And of course, the most well known is going to be Fountain of Youth in St. Augustine, which, as you can see, I gave it a cheesy alert there. Everything's kind of stuck in the 1970s, though they are getting much better at interpreting Native culture and things like that. It's not as white folk heavy as it used to be, but I also recommend the Timucua Ecological Preserve in Jacksonville, where they also reconstructed Fort Caroline, and that's what that hut that you see there on the right side of the screen is actually from Timucuan. The Safety Harbor Archaeological Site in Safety Harbor is gorgeous. That's what you see on the left hand of the screen from the top of the mound. The mound is still there and you can climb it. And it gives you, as you can see, a beautiful view of Tampa Bay. And then the image in the middle is Miami Circle, which is a relatively recent find. Real estate developers, when they were breaking ground to put up a new skyscraper in Miami, because that's Miami, uncovered basically it could have been a structure. It's post holes. I don't want to call it Stonehenge, but it's culturally significant enough to be like Stonehenge, and it's actually quite old for the New World. So if you're in Miami, go check that out. You never know what you're going to see. But yes, please visit our archaeological sites, especially now that Florida is dealing with a government that is a little less caring about the interior of the state. And we would love it if you would check out some old Florida, because I think you'll really enjoy it. And then if your desire to know more intensifies, here are some websites I highly recommend visiting. The Trail of Florida's Indian Heritage is a great place to start. It is your network of archaeological sites, museums, and interpretive historical sites. You can visit the state archives at floridamemory.org. There's also the Florida Museum at the University of Florida, which also lists archaeological sites. State parks also has archaeological programs that happen during non-COVID times, always worth checking out. And of course, the Florida Public Archaeology Network will let you know when there are digs going on and how to get involved. And any additional resources that you can visit. So any book by Michael Gannon is, he was the definitive historian of Florida, and he was just wonderful. Cross in the Sand, I have my copy here, is probably the most comprehensive study of the Spanish arrival on the peninsula. The artwork of Theodore Morris, a lot of those paintings that I was showing today is actually done by him. Please visit his website at losttribesofflorida.com or losttribesflorida.com. Of course, the Library of Congress is a wonderful site. All of the Florida State universities, especially the big four, UF, FSU, USF, UCF, etc., have resources on learning more about the First Nations. And as you can see, I also provided a link there for teachers from the University of South Florida, where I will be going to complete my PhD, by the way. And they provide wonderful information on Florida history. And then if there's anything I can do to provide you any more information, please contact me directly for specific sources. And that is a wrap, folks. That is my contact information. So jot down what you need. We've got like 3 minutes for questions before